All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a mini lecture on American psychologist Abraham Maslow and what's known as the hierarchy of needs. And this fits into the course as a way of moving from a focus on individual choice, all the virtue talk that we've done with Aristotle, and thinking about people's own behaviors and motivations and what virtues might be and whether we're good and bad and all that sort of thing, all important. But I think only one piece of the puzzle of living in society, of living with other people. And in our course title, we have the phrase searching together for the common good. So let's talk a little bit more in this module, and then definitely next week about how to think about the context in which we operate. Suppose we did that a little bit with Antigone, because she found herself in a society, and we thought about the godlike kings and power and democracy and those kinds of things. So maybe it's been threaded throughout, but this lecture shifts it back to thinking about the bigger picture. So what you might call the social structural dimension of flourishing, which you can find in Aristotle too, but that hasn't been our focus. So Maslow was born in 1908, died in 1970, so he's a 20th century American psychologist. And in that period, psychology as a science was getting figured out in America. So he's partly responsible for a bit of a paradigm shift in psychology. Psychology had been in the early 20th century very focused on dysfunction, on people who aren't doing well psychologically, on symptoms and cataloging symptoms. We still have that version of psychology around. But Abraham Maslow, through his work, started developing, at least alongside this other way of thinking about psychological dysfunction, an effort to think about human optimization, about what it looks like when things are going really well from a psychological perspective, a kind of flourishing, you could say. So with a quick thanks to Jamie, who's also working on this course, for pointing me in the direction of looking a bit at Maslow's development, which I'll tell you more about in a sec. So I want to tell a little bit of the story of how Maslow arrives at this idea of the hierarchy of needs, which I'll explain in more detail. When Maslow is about 30 years old, he's very interested in psychology already, and he's doing some work apparently with Ruth Benedict, who is a famous anthropologist. And one way of thinking about anthropology and psychology as a discipline is that they're both trying to figure out what it is to be human, and they both have to struggle with whether what makes us human is a general thing that applies to everybody, or if what makes us human is too rooted in a particular time and place and culture for us to talk very much about what we're like in general. So as a psychologist, as an anthropologist, these two have a presumption that we should be on the lookout for what makes all people human in general. And so Ruth Benedict advises, somehow, I don't know the details, that Maslow go to Canada, to Alberta region of Canada, to work with the Siksika tribe, a Blackfoot tribe in Canada, as a way of common anthropologist strategy to get out of the culture they find themselves immersed in and have a different cultural perspective in order to try to answer some of these questions. And so I should also acknowledge that a lot of what I'm about to tell you comes from a lot of great work by two scholars in Canada, Narcisse Blood and Ryan Heavyhead, and that a lot of this information I'm about to tell you about comes from an article. We'll put a link to the article on the module page, done by Teju Rabalochan. So thanks to all of them for helping me learn more about this. So he goes to work with this Siksika tribe in Canada, and he's there to test the universality of a theory about social hierarchy And the idea that anthropologists and psychologists in America are having, that social hierarchies are maintained by the dominance of some people over other people. So there's a theory about how everything works, about what people are like. Some people like in the human community, social hierarchies happen, and those happen through dominance of some people over other people. That's the theory. But when he gets there, he finds he encounters a culture very different from his own, and that these theories, in fact, don't work very well. So he does not see in Blackfoot tribal society a quest for dominance, really. And he's just overwhelmed by astounding levels of social cooperation, very little inequality, built-in processes for restorative justice. Everybody's well-fed, nobody goes without, and just high levels of life satisfaction. And as Maslow himself puts it at one point, that he says that he calculates that 80 to 90% of that Blackfoot tribe had a quality of self-esteem that he saw in only 5 to 10% of his own population, of modern Western American population. So 80 to 90% self-esteem in that Blackfoot tribe, and only 5 to 10% in his own culture, which gets him thinking. And that's what pushes him to start to think that rather than focusing on, he starts to realize the dysfunction of his own culture. But then within psychology, he also realizes that we should be trying harder to think about when things are going well, and what does it look like when things are going well. How to find those positive aspects of human psychology and talk about them. A quick little anecdote specifically about the quality of generosity, since that's something we talked about in Aristotle work, generosity as a human virtue. He discovers that in this Blackfoot tribe, there was that wealth, the wealth itself was not really measured by money or property, but by generosity. Generous people were seen to be the wealthiest people, or wealth and generosity were intimately tied together. So he witnesses what's called a giveaway ceremony, his first week that he spends with that tribe. And so a giveaway ceremony is apparently the members of the tribe arrange their teepees in a circle, and then they publicly pile up all that they've collected over the last year, this kind of communal display of what they've gathered and collected over the last year. And then those with the most possessions tell stories of how they amassed those things. And then they give every last thing away to those who are in greater need. So here's my wealth. Now I will share it with everybody here. So clearly not how our culture works. So how do we think about that sort of thing? And if we're in search of what is it to be human, is Maslow's culture closer? Is their culture closer? So out of this, he develops what comes to be known as the hierarchy of needs. And we're giving you a handout that has this displayed as a pyramid, which is famously how this idea gets communicated. I think the visual pyramid has something to do with its popularity, honestly. But so he didn't think of it as a pyramid, but he thought of it as just language for talking about what human flourishing requires. And just making clear that to flourish, you have to satisfy certain physiological needs. So we're at the bottom of the pyramid now. Food, water, warmth, rest, safety needs of basic safety and security and lodging. And then you have psychological needs that need to be met to have a flourishing life. Love, close relationships, friendship are all required for this Maslow version of what human flourishing looks like, that he learned partly from his experiences with the Siksika in Canada. You also need esteem. This is maybe a little bit related to Aristotle on pride, that you need some measure of prestige in your own life. Everybody does, a measure of accomplishment. And then what he calls flourishing is self-actualization, realizing full full potential. Apparently, there is a phrase for that that word. Kind of, you might think of it as the Siksika word for flourishing, and it means something like coming fully into one's own, of having arrived. All right, so that's a quick look at Maslow and his psychological theories that he developed in large part out of this experience with a culture very different from his own. And notice that it becomes both a constructive tool and a critical tool. So what do I mean by that? That if you take this hierarchy of needs, it's a constructive thing if you think of it as a target that we should be aiming at. That here are the lives that we should all be leading. They should look like this. And so shouldn't we individually and collectively be trying to optimize that for other people? It also becomes a critical tool because you can, if that is the flourishing version of life, you can use it as a kind of mirror against which you measure any particular culture or society. In other words, so you can see the dysfunction, you can see how it's falling short. And so that idea will carry a little bit into next week when we work on Marx. So structural features of society as it relates to human flourishing, and both the constructive and critical value of thinking about those kinds of things. All right, thanks.